Okay, cool. Well, let's make a start. And we're going to come to you first, I think, Dr. Box, because I want to ask you this question, because I've heard you say in the past that shock tactics don't always work, or potentially don't work full stop, and they can make things worse. So why are they still so popular, and what should we do instead?
Yeah, thanks, Terry. I think this is probably because of the research work that I've been doing as part of my PhD research, supported by Lisa. So it's nice to be on the call with Lisa today, who's my supervisor at Cranford when I did the work, who knows all about this topic, as does David too. So it's one that's been going around in the sector for many, many years. And I think it's an interesting question because we can really understand why people think it works. So you stand up in front of a classroom, you give some facts and figures, you maybe show some traumatic videos, and you notice that the classroom changes, that people go quiet. Young people that are normally a bit, unruly might actually look like they're paying attention. And I think what that leads to is people going, oh, wow, what we've done, it's worked. And what we know from all of the research in this area is that enacting emotion, if you like, doesn't necessarily lead to behaviour change. What fear appeals do is they capture people's attention, which is what you're seeing in that classroom environment. But when we look at the many, many studies that have been done across so many different areas of public health, what we find is you might have some very small immediate impacts on, say, people's attitudes or their intentions, but it disappears really, really very quickly. And so, yeah, they're only really very much short-term effects. That's not to say that fear appeals can never work. In the evidence, if you're kind of looking at something where people feel very vulnerable, they need to make a one-off behaviour to actually address that. Vaccination can be one of those where you need people to take a vaccination, although it's still not recommended in public health if you go that route in terms of fear or threat appeal. But there's certain areas that it can potentially work. But if we're thinking about driving, we're asking people to make sensible choices about what they're doing day in, day out over many years. So we can't expect a one-off 1 hour intervention to then go on and influence people's behaviour for all of that time. And we also know that there's some differences between males and females, particularly young males and females, which is where my research has been based. And we know that young males are much more likely as a group to experience what's called third person effects and say, that's awful what you've just talked to me about, but I'm a brilliant driver. That happens to other people. That doesn't happen to me. I know my capabilities are great, so I'm not going to be in those experiences. And then, I think almost just as bad is the fact we typically find that young women are much more likely to become much more anxious about driving if they're faced with those issues without it actually improving their opportunities for safety in the future. So, and it's not just driving where this has happened. You can look at some other areas of public health. So you might have heard of in the US for many, many years, they ran the Scared Straight program, which was taking young people into the prison system, trying to show them, how awful it was to be in prison and therefore to dissuade them from offending. And as we know around that sort of behaviour, it's much more your environment that you're in and your circumstances that can be affecting whether you take part in criminality or not. And actually what they found was when they looked at the control group, that those that had gone and had that experience were much more likely to offend and end up in jail as a result, not as a result, but it didn't help, put it that way. Similarly, there was a study done in Australia giving teenagers infant simulator dolls to try and prevent pregnancy. And lo and behold, when they compared it to the control group over time, actually there was more live pregnancies within the group that had experienced the simulator dolls. So what we sometimes think of as common sense, when you end up looking at the evidence about whether it does affect it doesn't really necessarily tie up. So I think what we much more need to focus on, and I'm sure we'll be talking about this today, I'm sure you've already talked about it today, is about how do we help people succeed? That's much more effective than pointing out all the problems and saying, don't do this. So, and I'm sure Dave is going to be talking all about this, but we know hazard perception training is really important, giving people those coping skills, confidence, and that sort of feeling of positive identities and what they can do, coping mechanisms, strategies, resilience education, all of that going forwards. And obviously driving instructors that are here today are, really well placed to build those relationships because there's that repeated contact over weeks, months. You're not just going in for 1 hour and then disappearing and never to be seen again. You become part of the fabric which that person is involved with. So there's lots of positive things that, driving instructors can take, but hopefully that's given you, hopefully in a bit of a nutshell, kind of why we know from the research evidence that fear and threat appeals don't work.
Sure. Is there anything you want to add on to this or any questions you want to ask the guys?
So I think first of all, speaking of the 1980s, Lisa, I'm still terrified of swimming in the sea
From Joe.
because I saw Jaws in the 1980s.
Yeah.
I'm still, I can't do it. I can't do it. Um, I think I would draw attention to the links between everything that the panel is talking about there and our training to become driving instructors. So when I was doing the bright writing the bright coaching diploma, we looked at Fiona Filan's paper. I think it was for the RAC Foundation, was that had all the behavioural change techniques that we have available to us potentially, and it became apparent that my interpretation of that is that if you're trying to qualify to become a driving instructor, there are three behavioural change techniques that you need to demonstrate to the DVSA that you can deliver. It's not phrased this way, but this is what it is. If you're delivering a Part 3 test, you have to be able to demonstrate to the DVSA that you can tell people how to do things. You have to be able to give feedback, and you have to be able to tell people about consequences. And if you fail to do either of these things, then you find it very, very difficult to pass and become a driving instructor. And this is despite the fact that in the national standards, our national standards for driver and rider training, that's supposed to be our Bible, and it kind of is a Bible because hardly anyone reads it. There's a line that says driving instructors must know how to give feedback about risk-related issues so that you motivate and help the learner to change their behaviour without increasing fear-based responses. So we are supposed to be able to do that without increasing fear-based responses. But at the same time, we have to be able to talk about consequences. So there's a disconnect there. And because the training is pitched to help people pass tests, we have driving instructors who live in this bubble of consequences, just delivering messages about consequences all the time. And it's a source of frustration for me and many other people.
Lisa, we'll start with you with this one, I think. As vehicles do more of the driving for us, what concerns you most, and how do we stop drivers becoming too reliant upon that technology?
Oh gosh, here we go. This is a big
I can
topic.
see.
I would say that there's probably more human factors specialists working in this field than there are in many others. So really, let's start with a sort of a behavioural perspective. My main concern, I spent 3 or 4 years looking into this. We were funded by the EPSRC, UKRI group funding to look at what's called trustworthy autonomous systems. And we were looking at how people adapt to technology in automated vehicles. Now, when I say automated vehicles, it's very different to your assisted vehicles. An assisted vehicle, most people will have nowadays. It will be a vehicle that has adaptive cruise control, or it will have collision avoidance systems. It will have all sorts of perhaps even lane keeping type technology. So driver assistance is in one sense something that we're seeing becoming kind of a standard in new vehicles. However, what isn't very clear still in the academic literature is the effect that those systems have on behaviour over the longer term. Most of the studies that have been published are on short-term benefits, and so the implication is that if the technology is rolled out across the whole of the fleet in any particular country, then you're going to see a net benefit on the numbers of people being killed and injured because the technology is saving them. Well, we recently published a study on electronic stability control, where the vehicle, the technology actually steadies the vehicle in the event of a skid. And what we found was that actually the manufacturers were claiming that this led to a significant reduction in the number of single vehicle crashes because the vehicle was able to avoid skidding. But actually the evidence suggests that it was far, far less than people imagined. that, you know, we looked at it over 30 years, and the impact of electronic stability control was nowhere near as significant as you would imagine. And happy to have that paper sent around if anyone wants to see it. So the implication for this is that, well, why are we not seeing the benefit of these systems on the numbers of people being killed and injured that we would have expected? Well, it's because of the way in which people adapt to those systems. Because unfortunately, when people think that they are safe because of the technology, they take more risks. And it's referred to in the literature as behavioral adaptation or unintended consequences. There's been various theories and models put forward about this. And so, you know, we can't just assume that the technology is going to protect us. And even worse, now that we're moving forward to automated vehicles where we're expected to supervise the system, i.e., we have our hands off the wheel and our eyes off the road. We're allowed to do that, not for long, but we are allowed to do that. We are expected to be monitoring the system in the event that the system can't cope with all eventuality. Like, for example, where there's too much going on, or the sensors are obscured, or whatever. And then you have to become situationally aware sufficiently to be able to take over control of that vehicle. And this is the problem, because people, unfortunately, when they're given less to do less, surprisingly. And worse still is that they get distracted by other secondary tasks not relevant to driving, like more likely to use their mobile phones, more likely to, you know, start eating and drinking and doing all the sorts of other things that you do, you know, whilst you're sort of imagining that you're sat in your lounge when actually you're traveling at 60 miles an hour in a very high risk situation. So there's kind of like a lot of potential ways in which people adapt to technology. Like, for example, a study by TRL many years ago showed that when other road users considered that the vehicle next to them was autonomous, i.e., not even a driver in it, then people actually drove closer to that vehicle. You know, why would they do that? Well, because they see that as a robot that's going to get out of their way. So even though you're in an autonomous vehicle, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're safe, because other people might behave differently towards that vehicle. So there's a real kind of interaction between the human and the system in transport, and something that we really don't understand very much. And so I have a lot of concerns about new technology coming through, that I don't think we're going to see the benefits that people expect. You know, I'm very worried about robo-taxis coming to London, for example. You know, and I'm kind of concerned about, you know, the lack of research in this field, really, especially long-term research.
Yeah, David, we're going to talk about the hazard perception. What are the benefits of the hazard perception test to learner drivers, and what does it miss, if anything?
Right. First of all, I think the hazard perception test has done a really good thing for the country in terms of helping reduce collision rates over the years. I say this because actually, in publication, I'm a critic of the hazard perception test, but sometimes that can come over too critical. I'm actually a big fan of it, and I think it's great. I just think there are some things it misses, and it could be better. We've not had any really great updates to the hazard perception test at all since it was introduced in 2002. The only thing that's changed is in 2015 we moved over to CGI clips rather than video clips. The test itself has remained the same throughout. Now, what does the test do for our learner drivers? Well, it sets a line in the sand and it encourages practice. I think that's the key thing. So there's lots of companies out there with their apps that people can download, or the DVDs of old that you'd get from your supermarket shelf, and practice watching those clips. Now, the reason why practice is important is because essentially Watching hazards is concatenating potentially years of experience. So the way that we think hazard perception has developed naturally is that you go out driving, you see things that were dangerous, could have put you in harm. You've escaped by the skin of your teeth, or another bit of luck, or maybe by skill. But that instance sits there then in memory somewhere, or there may be some rules extracted from that sit there in the brain. And that library of events, or that library of rules that we distill out of those events, becomes our hazard perception skill. We naturally build that up over years, seeing these dangerous events. Now, if we don't see many dangerous events over the first year, because let's say we're not driving for a while because we're waiting for insurance, and then when we do get it, the parents won't let us out that often because we're sharing a car. It's very slow to build up, or we're very slow to build up that memory for all of these hazards because we just don't have exposure to them. By watching them in a series of clips, we get that rapid exposure to them, which fills up that hazard perception center in the brain. So that's great. Now, admittedly, the exposure we get to those hazards is not as great or as memory inducing as the real thing. Because the real thing is a multi-sensory experience, possibly with some goosebumps if you did come close to having a collision, and then that sticks in your memory. I still remember the first time I passed my test. I was sat with a friend of mine driving in lane 3 of the motorway, pulling back into lane 2 when a HGV slightly ahead of me in lane 1 started to pull out. Never had occurred to me before that actually pulling back in from lane 3 could be dangerous because something's pulling out from lane 1 at the same time. But that instance stuck with me and has meant that I've always checked for those hazard precursors in the future when making that lane 3 to lane 2 maneuver. So it's not as good as the real thing, but the benefit is that you get to see a lot more hazards in a much shorter time, and also in situations where you're not at risk of having a collision in the first place. There are problems, and I'm aware that we're running out of time, so I won't go through them all, but we're limited in the sense that we're just looking at this little screen here, and hazards come from anywhere. Hazards come from behind. Hazards come from the sides. We don't have any mirror information on the screen. We don't have access to anything else in the world. Plus, also, we're doing a hazard perception test. We know we're looking for hazards, when in the real world, we might be thinking about 101 different things, not least navigating, but also what we're going to have for tea tonight. So the hazard perception test is still an artificial test in that. Also, the one thing that we miss from our current hazard perception test is turning at junctions. We don't have many, if any, clips, because even I've not seen through all of the hazard clips. But one of the reasons that the vast majority, if not all of the clips involve driving down a straight road is because, of course, when you've got accessibility issues for the whole population, if you put a turn in a video screen like that, there could be 1 in 100 people that start to feel a bit nauseated by that sort of maneuver. So there are all sorts of problems that we have with that. There are ways around these. We've worked with VR. We've added mirrors to our hazard test. We've made sure that our hazard tests are vehicle specific. The idea of getting a HGV driver to sit a car test is bonkers. The idea of getting a motorcyclist to sit a car-based hazard perception test, equally bonkers. We need vehicle-specific tests. We need to be able to see information from behind. Ideally, we need to be able to see information from the full 360. So there are ways and means to overcome all of these problems, but it's getting the evidence base in place, and then it's convincing the people who run these tests that changes need to be made. But we've got a great opportunity ahead of us with the new EU directive that requires hazard perception testing and training to be rolled out across all member states, I think by 2029. So this is an opportunity now not just to influence the UK, but influence the continent as well.